The sheriff sent his strongest hunters for a slave girl, but she had already laid the perfect trap for them. What he couldn't know was that every step his men took into the wilderness was exactly what she had planned. For months, Naomi had prepared for this moment, studying the land, setting her snares, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. The hunters were known for their cruelty and perfect record. No runaway had ever escaped them. But this time they weren't the predators, they were the prey. Naomi had been the sheriff's property for 7 years, not just any slave. She was his prized possession, the one he paraded before guests to demonstrate his wealth and power. Her intelligence made her valuable, but it also made her dangerous. When she vanished in the dead of night 3 weeks ago, the sheriff's rage shook the entire county. This wasn't just about recovering property. This was personal humiliation that demanded retribution. "I want her back alive," the sheriff snarled to his men, but barely. "Make sure she understands the cost of her defiance. The punishment awaiting Naomi would be brutal and public." A message to every slave who dared dream of freedom. The sheriff had already prepared the whipping post in the town square. What terrified the other slaves wasn't just that the sheriff was sending hunters. It was that he was sending the pack, 5 men whose names were whispered in fear across 3 states. But deep in the wilderness, Naomi moved with purpose. Each footprint she left was deliberate, each broken branch a signal, each stream crossing calculated. She wasn't running blindly. She was counting steps, noting landmarks, and checking the position of the sun. The slave girl, who had spent years memorizing the sheriff's maps while cleaning his study, now navigated the wilderness with uncanny precision. As night fell, she climbed a ridge and looked back at the valley below. In the distance, 5 torches moved exactly where she expected them to be. Naomi smiled. What the sheriff didn't know was that his hunters weren't following Naomi. She was leading them. The pack moved through the forest with practiced efficiency. 5 men, each chosen for their specific skills, bound together by years of successful hunts and the substantial bounties they commanded. In 3 counties, their reputation preceded them. Men who could track a ghost through a snowstorm, as the saying went. They had never failed to bring back their quarry, and the price for their services reflected this perfect record. Leading them was Silas, a former army tracker whose weathered face rarely betrayed emotion. His eyes, the pale blue of winter ice, missed nothing. Every bent twig, every displaced stone, every subtle sign that someone had passed through. Silas read the forest like scholars read books. 23 years of hunting had left him lean and hard as hickory, with a network of scars mapping the dangers of his profession across his skin. He'd tracked deserters during the war, then criminals for the law, and finally slaves for whoever paid. The morality of his work had long ceased to trouble him. Behind him walked the brothers Elijah and Samuel, who communicated with gestures and glances honed since childhood. Twins, though not identical, Elijah was taller by 2 in and Samuel broader through the shoulders. They moved in perfect synchronicity, covering each other's blind spots, a habit that had saved their lives more than once. The brothers specialized in the close work, the actual capture, using an elaborate system of snares and nets they developed themselves. They took pride in bringing in runaways with minimal damage, not from compassion, but because damaged property brought lower rewards. Then came Tobias, whose massive frame and brutal reputation made even the other hunters uncomfortable. Standing nearly 6 and 1/2 ft tall with hands like ham hocks, and a chest as broad as a rain barrel, Tobias was their insurance against resistance. He carried an arsenal, 2 pistols, a rifle, a wicked hunting knife, and a blackjack for rendering captives unconscious. Despite his size, he moved with surprising grace, stepping carefully where the brothers and Silas had already tested the ground. Rumors followed Tobias about what he'd done before joining the pack, whispers of excessive violence that had forced him to leave 3 states in succession. Bringing up the rear was Reed, the youngest, but perhaps the most dangerous, a man who enjoyed his work too much. Barely 25, with the face of a cherub and the eyes of something feral, Reed had joined the pack 4 years ago after sealers discovered him tracking runaways on his own using methods that left the sheriff's office disturbed even as they paid his bounties. Reed collected souvenirs from each capture, a button, a scrap of cloth, a lock of hair. The others tolerated this peculiarity because Reed's instincts for finding hidden quarry were uncanny. He seemed to sense fear, to smell it like a predator, leading them unerringly to concealed hideouts others would have missed. The 5 men had been on Naomi's trail for nearly a week now, following her path from the sheriff's plantation deep into the wilderness. The first days had been easy tracking. A slave woman with no woodcraft would naturally leave obvious signs, but something had changed in the past 2 days. The trail remained clear, but almost too clear, as if she'd stopped trying to hide her passage entirely. "She's smart for a girl slave," Sealers remarked, crouching to study fresh tracks in the soft earth. He ran his fingers over the impression of a small foot, noting the depth and direction, moving fast, but not panicked, conserving energy. "Smart don't matter when you're bleeding," Reed said, fingering the coiled whip at his belt. His voice held an eager edge that made Samuel glance at him with barely concealed disgust. "Sheriff says we teach her a lesson before bringing her back. Says she needs to be an example." Tobias spat a stream of tobacco juice that spattered against a nearby oak. "3 weeks out here alone, probably half dead already. Wild animals might have saved us the trouble." "Cougar's been seen in these parts. She's alive," Sealers cut in, standing and adjusting his worn leather hat. "And she knows these woods better than expected. Been planning this escape for some time, I'd wager." Elijah, who rarely spoke more than necessary, pointed to a peculiar arrangement of broken branches ahead. "Not right," he said simply. Sealers nodded, having noticed the same thing. The path ahead was too obvious, the signs of passage too convenient. In 15 years of hunting runaways, he had never followed tracks this clear, this consistent. Most slaves fled in terror, their trails erratic and desperate. Naomi's path showed purpose, even calculation. "We proceed with caution," Sealers ordered, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Something doesn't feel right." Samuel nodded in agreement. "Been thinking the same since yesterday. Like we're being," he hesitated, embarrassed by his own suspicion. "Led," Sealers finished for him. "Like we're being led." Reed laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant in the hushed forest. "Led by a house slave, a woman." He shook his head. "Fear's making you soft, old man. She's running scared, making mistakes, that's all." Sealers didn't argue, but his eyes narrowed as they continued forward. 30 years in these forests had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming warnings he couldn't quite articulate. As dusk approached, they made camp beneath a rocky outcropping that provided shelter on 3 sides. The site seemed ideal, defensible with clear lines of sight to the surrounding forest, and a small stream gurgling nearby for fresh water. Too ideal perhaps, but fatigue overruled caution. The brothers took first watch, while the others ate dried meat and hard bread in silence. Tobias cleaned his weapons methodically, the ritual as familiar as breathing. Reed carved intricate patterns into a piece of wood with his knife, occasionally glancing up at the darkening forest with an eager expression. "We'll have her by noon tomorrow," Sealers said with certainty as he spread his bedroll on the hard ground. "The tracks lead straight to the river. Nowhere to go from there except swim, and few slaves can manage that. And if she tries," Reed asked, his knife pausing mid-carve, "then we fish out a corpse instead." Sealers replied flatly, "Either way, the sheriff gets his property back." As night fully descended, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No owls called, nocturnal creatures rustled in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. Samuel noted this to his brother during their watch, but Elijah merely shrugged. Animals often went quiet when humans were present. None of them noticed the small figure watching from the shadows above the outcropping, or how carefully she had positioned them exactly where she wanted them to sleep. Naomi observed the 5 men with cold calculation, counting weapons, noting which hunter took which position. Every detail was committed to memory, every movement analyzed. She had spent 7 years studying the sheriff's hunters whenever they visited the plantation, learning their methods, their weaknesses, their habits. Now, as they slept beneath her hiding place, she knew more about them than they could possibly imagine. She knew that Silas favored his right leg from an old injury. She knew that the brothers, for all their skill, were superstitious about certain forest signs. She knew that Tobias, despite his fearsome appearance, was terrified of snakes, and she knew that Reed's eagerness made him careless. Knowledge was power, and in the coming day Naomi intended to use every scrap of it. This was not a chase. It was a carefully orchestrated dance, and she was leading. As she slipped away into the darkness, a slight smile touched her lips. The trap was set, the bait was laid, and the pack, for all their experience and brutality, had walked right into position. By this time tomorrow, the hunters would become the hunted. Dawn broke with a heavy mist, clinging to the forest floor, transforming familiar terrain into an ethereal landscape of shadows and silhouettes. The pack stirred early, each man falling into the routine established over countless hunts, checking weapons, consuming a cold breakfast, erasing all signs of their camp. There was a tense silence among them, the unspoken awareness that something about this particular hunt felt different, dangerous in ways they couldn't articulate. Sealers knelt by the remnants of their small fire, scattering the ashes and covering them with fresh earth. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the peculiarities of this chase. 23 years of tracking had given him an instinct for trouble, and every fiber of his being was now alert to it. "You're quiet this morning, old man," Reed observed, sharpening his knife against a small wet stone. The rhythmic scraping sound cut through the morning stillness. Having second thoughts about catching this one, just thinking, Sealers replied, not rising to the bait. Reed was always looking to provoke, to create friction. It was part of what made him dangerous and unreliable. Tobias finished checking his pistols and slid them into the holsters at his belt. "Been wondering something myself," he rumbled, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff said this woman was his house slave, reading books, serving at his table, that sort of thing. What of it?" Samuel asked, carefully coiling a length of rope. "Just seems odd as all. House slaves run less often than field hands. They got privileges, better food, easier work, and when they do run," Tobias hesitated, searching for the right words, "they usually don't last this long in the wild, don't have the skills." Elijah, ever the more observant of the twins, nodded in silent agreement. He had been thinking the same thing, but as usual had kept his concerns to himself. "Trails still clear," Silas announced after a brief scout ahead. He returned to the group, brushing dew from his sleeves, heading straight for the river, just as expected. "We'll have her cornered before the sun's at its peak." The river represented a natural boundary, a rushing barrier of white water that swelled with spring melt, too dangerous for most to attempt crossing. For a runaway slave, it typically meant the end of the line, a place where options narrowed to surrender, or a desperate, often fatal attempt to swim across. The pack had cornered many fugitives against this same river over the years, the terrain working in their favor like a loyal sixth member of their team. "What if she's already crossed?" Samuel asked, adjusting the coil of rope slung across his shoulder. Unlike his brother, Samuel tended to voice his concerns, to think aloud. Sealers shook his head. No sign of it. Besides, that water's running high and fast with the spring melt. "She'd have been swept downstream, drowned, most likely. Shame if that happened," Reed remarked, disappointment evident in his voice. He tested the edge of his freshly sharpened knife against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood that he licked away with disturbing satisfaction. "Sheriff wants..." His message delivered proper. Said she made him look the fool in front of the county judge and 2 visiting plantation owners. Disappeared right in the middle of serving dinner. "You're too eager for the hurting part, Reed," Tobias said with a frown. "Job's to bring runaways back, not to enjoy it." Reed's eyes flashed dangerously. "You going soft on me, big man?" Maybe you need reminding what these people are. Property, nothing more. Enough. Silas cut in, his tone brooking no argument. Save your energy for the tracking. We've still got ground to cover. They moved with increased urgency now, scent of imminent success driving them forward. The forest began to thin as they approached the river valley, the terrain sloping downward, becoming rockier and more treacherous. The undergrowth changed too. Fewer of the dense thicket that had dominated the higher elevations, replaced by scattered ferns and moss-covered stones. The sound of rushing water grew steadily louder, drowning out the natural forest sounds. As they descended, Silas noticed peculiar markings on several trees, small notches cut at regular intervals up the trunks. They seemed deliberate rather than natural, but he couldn't fathom their purpose. He filed the observation away, another oddity in a hunt already filled with them. The mist began to burn away as the morning sun strengthened, revealing glimpses of the landscape ahead. Through breaks in the trees, they could occasionally see the river itself, a churning ribbon of white and blue, swollen with snow melt from the mountains to the north. 2 hours into their morning trek, Elijah froze suddenly, raising a closed fist, their signal to halt. The others immediately stopped, hands moving instinctively to weapons. Elijah pointed silently to the ground ahead. There, pressed clearly into a patch of mud, was a fresh footprint, small, unmistakably female, and no more than an hour old. She's slowing down, Tobias observed with satisfaction, his voice a low rumble, exhaustion finally catching up. 3 weeks in the wilderness would wear on anyone, let alone a house slave. Silas crouched to examine the print more closely. It was perfect, too perfect almost. The impression showed no sign of dragging or stumbling that would indicate fatigue. Instead, it was firmly planted, deliberate, as if the maker had stood there purposefully before moving on. The track seemed deliberately placed, almost as if he didn't complete the thought. A distant crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under weight. The 5 men instantly dropped into defensive crouches, weapons appearing in hands as if conjured there. That direction, Silas whispered, pointing toward a dense thicket about 50 yards ahead, where the forest reclaimed some of its thickness before the final descent to the river. Elijah, Samuel, circle right. Tobias, with me left. Reed, stay center as backup. The brothers melted into the undergrowth with practiced silence. Their movement so coordinated they seemed to share a single mind. Tobias, despite his size, moved with surprising stealth alongside Silas, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid twigs or dry leaves. Reed remained in position, eyes gleaming with anticipation, his whip now uncoiled and ready in one hand, knife in the other. They advanced in their practiced pincer movement, closing in on the thicket from 3 directions. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Through gaps in the vegetation, Silas caught a glimpse of movement, something dark shifting behind the leaves. He signaled to the others, target confirmed with the coordination of predators who had hunted together for years. They surged forward simultaneously, converging on the thicket from all sides, leaving no escape route. "We have you surrounded," Silas called out, his voice carrying authority honed through decades of such moments. "Come out now and you won't be harmed." The promise was a familiar one, though not entirely truthful. The sheriff had been explicit about wanting Naomi returned alive, but taught a lesson. Still, Silas preferred to take quarry without a struggle when possible. Fighting led to injuries, and injured property brought lower payments. The thicket remained still. No sound of panicked movement, no desperate attempt to flee. This too was unusual. In Silas's experience, cornered runaways typically responded in one of 2 ways, either freezing in terror or making a frantic, doomed attempt to break through the circle of hunters. This eerie stillness suggested something else entirely. Tobias stepped forward, parting the branches with the barrel of his rifle, and froze. Instead of a terrified runaway, they found only a dark shawl draped carefully over a low branch arranged to mimic human movement when the wind blew. Beneath it lay a small pile of stones, and atop these, placed with deliberate care, was a crude doll fashioned from twigs and leaves. Its head was crowned with 5 smaller sticks. "What in hell?" Tobias began, his voice trailing off as the implications became clear. The doll had been created to represent a person, the 5 sticks atop its head, 5 men, the pack. This wasn't the desperate trick of a frightened fugitive. This was a message, a taunt. A tremendous crash interrupted his realization as a deadfall of logs and stones suddenly released from above, cascading down the slope toward them. The brothers, positioned farther uphill, leapt aside just in time, diving behind the trunks of massive oaks. Tobias wasn't as fortunate. A rolling log caught him squarely in the shoulder, sending him sprawling with a pained roar that echoed through the forest. Ambush! Silas shouted, but his warning came too late. More traps triggered in quick succession. A hidden pit opened beneath Reed's feet, sending him plummeting with a startled cry that transformed quickly into curses. A net of vines and branches entangled Samuel, hoisting him several feet off the ground. In a tangled web of vegetation, a cascade of dislodged stones forced Elijah to dive for cover, separating him from the group and pinning him against a fallen tree. Silas alone remained unscathed, his veteran instincts having pulled him clear at the first sign of danger. He spun in a circle, rifle raised, trying to locate the source of the attack, but there was no attacker visible, only the consequences of carefully laid traps. These weren't improvised snares set in desperate haste. These were engineered mechanisms that had required planning, knowledge, and time to construct. Show yourself, he demanded of the forest, his voice carrying a note of incredulity beneath the anger. Only silence answered him, punctuated by Reed's increasingly creative curses from the pit, and Tobias's pained groans as he struggled to his feet, his right arm hanging useless at his side, possibly broken at the shoulder. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, came a sound that chilled even Silas's hardened heart. Laughter, distinctly female, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the hysterical laughter of someone unhinged by fear or desperation, but something controlled, measured, almost musical in its confidence. She planned this, Silas muttered in disbelief, the rifle in his hand suddenly seeming inadequate. Every step of it, the realization struck him with the force of physical blow. They hadn't been tracking Naomi for the past week. She had been leading them step by step into a maze of her own design. The 2 perfect tracks, the convenient camping spots, the clear trail always heading predictably toward the river, all of it had been orchestrated to bring them to this precise location at this precise time. As if confirming his thoughts, a voice called out from the distance, too far to pinpoint. The sheriff taught me well, didn't he? 7 years watching, learning, planning. The voice was calm, articulate, carrying none of the regional dialect common among the plantation slaves. This was the voice of someone educated, someone who had spent years in proximity to power, absorbing its lessons. Silas raised his rifle toward the voice, but it was futile. She was already moving, her words coming from a different direction with each phrase. He showed me maps of these woods, made me memorize them while I served his guests. Stand there, girl, and be silent, he would say. So I stood and I was silent, and I learned another direction now, farther away, moving in a careful circle around their position. Showed me how you hunt, how you track, how you think. He was so proud of his pack of hunters, told stories of your exploits over dinner while I poured the wine. Best slave catchers in 3 states, he would boast. The brothers were frantically trying to regroup, Samuel still struggling with the net entanglement, while Elijah worked to free him with a knife. Tobias had managed to stand, but was clearly injured, his face contorted with pain, one arm cradled against his massive chest. I laid these traps weeks ago. Naomi's voice continued, now seeming to come from behind them. One by one, night after night, while the plantation slept. The sheriff Unk's favorite slave, free to move about the house after dark, gathering what I needed. A length of rope here, a tool there, small things never missed. Reed had finally clawed his way out of the pit, his face scratched and bleeding, his eyes wild with rage. His fine clothes were torn and mudded, his prized whip lost somewhere in the darkness below. When I ran, it wasn't a desperate flight. Naomi continued, her voice now moving again, impossible to track. It was the final step in a plan years in the making. The sheriff thought he was sending you after a frightened rabbit. Instead, he sent you after a fox who had studied the hounds. You're still trapped. Silas called back, trying to regain control of the situation, to assert the reality as he understood it. The river's ahead. There's nowhere to go. That laugh again, confident and mocking. The river was never my obstacle, Hunter. It was yours. The words made no sense to Silas. The river had always been their ally in these hunts, a natural barrier that cornered their quarry. How could it possibly be an obstacle for the pack rather than the runaway? A new sound reached them then, hoofbeat, as rapidly approaching from the direction they had come. Silas spun around, raising his rifle just as three riders burst into view through the trees. "Drop your weapons," commanded the lead rider, a grim-faced man wearing the distinct uniform of a northern militia. All three had rifles trained on the pack, and behind them, Silas could make out more riders approaching. "By authority of the Underground Railroad, you are trespassing on free territory," the militia leader announced, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. This land beyond the river was seated in the new boundary treaty. You're a half-mile inside the northern line. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The border had indeed been redrawn after the recent territorial disputes, but the river had always been the recognized boundary. How could they be north of the line when they hadn't yet crossed the water? As if reading his thoughts, Naomi's voice came one final time now from somewhere near the approaching riders. "The river bends, Hunter. Maps show it as a straight line, but it curves northward for 2 miles before turning south again. Creates a pocket of northern territory on this side of the water. The sheriff receives correspondence from the governor about such matters. He has me read it to him at night when his eyes are tired. Information is power, Hunter. Remember that." The militia closed in, their horses moving with practiced ease through the forest. There were 5 of them now, all armed, all wearing the expressions of men who had dealt with slave hunters before and held them in particular contempt. "Your hunting days are over," their leader declared, "at least in these territories. The new treaty explicitly prohibits the recovery of fugitives who reach free soil. Any attempt to pursue them across the border is considered an act of aggression." "We didn't cross any damn border," Reed snarled, his hand still on his knife. "The river is the border, always has been." "Not anymore," the militia leader replied coldly. "The treaty signed last month adjusted the line to follow natural landmarks more precisely. The river bend created confusion, so the border now cuts straight across this section of forest." He pulled a folded document from inside his coat. "I have a copy of the new territorial map signed by both governors. You are currently standing on free soil." Silas slowly lowered his rifle, signaling the others to do the same. For the first time in 23 years of hunting, he had been thoroughly outmaneuvered, not by another tracker, not by desperate luck, but by the careful planning of a slave woman who had turned his own methods against him. This was her plan. "All along," he said quietly, almost to himself, "lead us across a border we didn't even know had moved." The militia leader's expression changed slightly, a hint of respect showing through the contempt. "The woman who contacted our station was exceptional. Arrived 3 days ago, told us exactly when and where you'd be arriving, even suggested we wait until you triggered her traps before making ourselves known." A thin smile crossed his face, said it would make you less likely to resist. 3 days ago, Tobias growled through clenched teeth, still nursing his injured shoulder. "That's impossible. We've been on her trail continuously. She couldn't have reached your station without us knowing." The militia leader shrugged. "Can't speak to that. Only know she arrived with information that proved accurate, very accurate, as it turns out." As the pack surrendered their weapons, Silas caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing, a small figure watching from the shadows, her face partially visible for just a moment before she turned away. She was dressed differently now, in clothes that would allow her to pass as a free woman of color in the Northern Territories, a simple but well-made dress, a proper bonnet covering her hair. In that brief instant of eye contact, Silas saw neither fear nor hatred in Naomi's expression. What he saw instead was infinitely more disturbing. The calm, measured gaze of a superior strategist acknowledging a defeated opponent. It was the look of someone who had seen every move in advance, who had choreographed this entire encounter from the moment she walked away from the sheriff's dinner table 3 weeks ago. Then she was gone, slipping away toward the river, not as a boundary to be feared, but as a pathway to the freedom that lay beyond. Silas understood now why she had led them to this particular spot. From here, she could cross into truly free territory under the protection of the militia, with no legal means for the sheriff to reclaim her. "You'll be escorted back to the recognized border," the militia leader informed them as his men collected the pack's weapons. "Any attempt to return to this territory will result in arrest and prosecution under Northern law." Silas nodded, accepting the inevitable. The hunt was over, their perfect record broken. But more than that, something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. For 23 years, he had tracked people he had considered property, things to be recovered rather than human beings with minds and wills of their own. Now, for the first time, he had been forced to confront the full humanity of his quarry, her intelligence, her patience, her capacity for complex planning. Behind him, Reed was still protesting, threatening retribution, while Tobias and the brothers silently accepted their defeat. But Silas's mind was already elsewhere, wondering what story they would tell the sheriff, how they would explain being outsmarted so completely by the woman he had considered his property. As they were led away from the river, back toward the southern territories, Silas realized that Naomi had left them with more than just humiliation and a failed hunt. She had left 5 of the most feared slave hunters in 3 states with a story no one would believe and a message that would eventually reach the sheriff himself. Some property could never truly be owned, some minds could never be chained, and sometimes the hunted became the hunter. In the years that followed, the pack would never again work together as a unit. Their reputation shattered by this single failure, they would drift apart, Silas to retirement, the brothers to more legitimate pursuits, Tobias and Reed to increasingly desperate and violent attempts to reclaim their former glory. And somewhere in the northern territories, a woman who had once been property would begin a new life as a free person, carrying with her the knowledge that had been meant to keep her enslaved, but which she had turned into the key to her liberation. The sheriff's prized possession had become her own woman through the power of patience, observation, and the understanding that information properly applied was more powerful than any whip or chain. Sheriff William Blackwood was not a man accustomed to failure. At 48, his imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a carefully maintained beard, now streaked with gray, commanded respect throughout the county. His family name adorned the largest plantation for 50 miles, and his word carried the weight of both law and wealth, which made the scene unfolding in his study all the more extraordinary. "You expect me to believe," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that my house slave, a woman who has served in my household for 7 years, outsmarted the 5 of you?" He looked from face to face of the pack, assembled uncomfortably before his massive oak desk. "That she laid traps, manipulated your movements, and deliberately led you across a border you didn't know had moved." Silas, standing slightly apart from the others, not at once. "That's exactly what happened, Sheriff. She used your own knowledge against us." The sheriff's fist came down hard on the desk, causing ink bottles to jump and papers to scatter. "Impossible. Naomi was educated. Yes, I permitted her to learn reading for household duties, but she was obedient, docile. She knew her place? Evidently not," Tobias muttered, his right arm still in a crude sling fashioned from torn cloth. The sheriff's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Watch your tone. I paid good money for your services, and you return with nothing but excuses and injuries." Reed, his face still bearing scratches from his fall into the pit, stepped forward. "Give us another chance. We know her methods now. We can cross into Northern Territory at night, grab her, be back across the border before anyone's the wiser, and risk an international incident." The sheriff scoffed. "The treaty is new and fragile." The governor himself warned against provocations. He shook his head. "No, she's beyond our reach now, legally at least." A heavy silence fell over the room. Through the tall windows, the plantation stretched out in ordered rows, slaves moving between the cotton plants under the watchful eye of overseers. The contrast between the controlled world outside and the chaos Naomi had created was stark. "There's something else you should know," Silas said finally, something the militia leader mentioned. The sheriff raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Naomi arrived at their station 3 days before we reached the border, 3 days during which we believed we were tracking her." Silas paused, letting the implications sink in. "She wasn't running from us, Sheriff. She was running on a schedule of her own making." The color drained from the sheriff's face as he processed this information. 3 days, that would mean she doubled back, Silas confirmed, created a false trail for us to follow while she moved freely elsewhere, probably used streams to hide her scent and tracks. The sheriff rose abruptly, turning to stare out the window. "Leave me, all of you." His voice had lost its edge of anger, replaced by something closer to unease. "Your payment will be reduced by half considering the failure." None of the pack protested the reduction, an unprecedented acceptance that spoke to how thoroughly this hunt had shaken them. They filed out silently, Silas last among them. At the door, he paused. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "you might want to check your study, your documents, your correspondence, if she was planning this for years, as she claimed." He left the thought unfinished, closing the door behind him. Alone, Sheriff Blackwood moved with sudden urgency to his desk. He unlocked the bottom drawer where he kept his most sensitive correspondence. Letters from the governor, records of financial transactions, maps of his holdings. Everything appeared undisturbed at first glance, but as he began examining the documents more carefully, cold realization dawned. Several letters had been unfolded and refolded slightly differently. The seal on one envelope from the Territorial Commission had been carefully broken and resealed, and the newest map showing the adjusted border along the river bend, the very information Naomi had used in her escape, had faint fingerprints along its edges that were not his own. For 7 years she had served in his house, silent and seemingly submissive. For 7 years she had watched, listened, and learned. And all that time she had been memorizing his secrets, studying his hunter's methods, and planning her path to freedom with a patience and intelligence he had fatally underestimated. As night fell over the plantation, the sheriff remained at his desk, a glass of bourbon untouched before him, confronting a disturbing question. How many other doxal slaves might be watching, waiting, and planning? Even now, in the quarters beyond Main House, whispers had already begun to spread. Whispers of Naomi's escape, of the pack's defeat, of possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just days before. The story was transforming with each telling, growing into something more than truth, a legend, a beacon, a promise that careful planning could overcome even the most formidable obstacles to freedom. And far to the north, in a small but comfortable room provided by the Underground Railroad, Naomi unpacked the few possessions she had carried with her, including a small hand-drawn map of the territories, carefully annotated in her precise handwriting. Freedom, she had discovered, was not simply a place beyond a border. It was a state of mind that began the moment she had decided that her life belonged to no one but herself. She carefully folded the map and placed it in a drawer. Its purpose was fulfilled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, a life to be built on her own terms. For the first time in 7 years, Naomi smiled without restraint as she extinguished the lamp. Spring 1853, Philadelphia. The classroom hummed with the energy of 20 young students, their faces intent as they worked through their arithmetic lessons. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating floating dust motes and casting golden rectangles across the polished wooden floor. At the front of the room, a woman moved between the desks, her steps measured and graceful, pausing occasionally to offer guidance or encouragement. "Remember to carry the one, Thomas," she said softly, resting a hand briefly on a young boy's shoulder. "Try again." The boy, no more than 9, with bright eyes that reflected both intelligence and the lingering weariness of one who had known hardship, nodded earnestly and bent back over his slate. Naomi watched as understanding dawned on his face, followed by the quiet pride of mastery. These moments were what she lived for now. Naomi Freeman had been teaching at the Philadelphia Colored School for 6 years now, building a reputation as one of the most effective educators in the city. Her students consistently demonstrated exceptional progress, particularly in reading, mathematics, and critical thinking, skills she emphasized above all others. Parents sought placement in her classroom, aware that Miss Freeman demanded more from her pupils than other teachers, but also that she somehow managed to extract the very best from each child, regardless of background or natural ability. Knowledge is freedom, she often told them, her voice taking on a resonance that made even the most restless children pause and listen. What you carry in your mind can never be taken from you. She never explicitly spoke of her past to her students. It would not have been appropriate, and many were too young to understand the full implications. But the older children sometimes noticed how Miss Freeman's eyes took on a distant look when she spoke of freedom, how her normally perfect posture became even more erected, as if bracing against some invisible weight. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day's lessons. The children gathered their slates and books, filing out with the controlled chaos typical of youth suddenly released from study. Several called goodbyes to Miss Freeman, receiving her warm smile in return. A few lingered as they always did, children hungry for additional moments of her attention, or reluctant to return to crowded homes where quiet study was impossible. Miss Freeman, said a girl named Harriet, remaining at her desk. After the others had departed, I finished the extra mathematics problems you gave me. She held out a carefully written sheet of paper, her expression hopeful. Naomi took the offered work, scanning it with practiced eyes. Excellent work, Harriet. You've made tremendous progress. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a slim volume. I think you're ready for this now. The girl's eyes widened as she accepted the book. A primer on geometry, more advanced than anything available in the school's modest library. Thank you, Miss Freeman, she breathed, clutching the book to her chest. Remember our agreement, Naomi said gently. Once you've mastered it, I teach someone else. Harriet finished, nodding solemnly. Knowledge shared is knowledge strengthened. Precisely. Naomi smiled. Now you should head home before your mother worries. As the last student departed, Naomi began her daily ritual of preparing the classroom for tomorrow, straightening desks, cleaning the chalkboard, organizing materials for the next day's lessons. This methodical attention to detail was characteristic of everything she did, a habit formed during years when observation and planning had been essential to survival. The school building quieted around her, other teachers departing for their homes or responsibilities. Naomi preferred these solitary moments at day's end, using the time to reflect on each student's progress and adjust her approach accordingly. Teaching, she had discovered, required the same careful observation and strategic thinking that had once secured her freedom, identifying weaknesses, recognizing strengths, planning several steps ahead. A soft knock at the door interrupted her work. She turned to find William still standing in the doorway, his dignified presence immediately recognizable as one of Philadelphia's most prominent abolitionists and a key conductor on the Underground Railroad. Still had been instrumental in helping Naomi establish her new life in the city. His meticulous records of those he helped escape bondage had proven invaluable for reuniting separated families, and his connections throughout the free black community had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Miss Freeman, he greeted her with a slight bow. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, mister. Still, she replied, setting aside the stack of papers she'd been organizing. Even after years of acquaintance, they maintained this formal address in public spaces, a protective habit in a world where even in northern states the status of free black citizens remained precarious. What brings you to our humble school today? Still glanced briefly into the hallway, ensuring they were truly alone, before closing the door behind him. His expression, normally carefully composed for public interactions, showed signs of tension that immediately put Naomi on alert. News from the south, he said, his voice low. I thought you should hear it from me rather than the newspapers or street gossip. Naomi gestured to a chair, maintaining her composure, though her heart had quickened at his words. 10 years had passed since her escape, but the South and its memories never seemed quite far enough behind her. Every new fugitive arrival, every tightening of the laws regarding runaways, every report of increased bounties stirred the embers of vigilance that she suspected would never fully cool. Sheriff William Blackwood is dead, still said without preamble once they were seated. Stroke, according to my Correspondent, his plantation is being divided among his creditors. Apparently, he made some unwise investments in recent years, lost much of his fortune. The Blackwood name doesn't carry the weight it once did. Naomi received this information with a stillness that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts. Her hands, resting on the desk before her, neither trembled nor clenched. Only someone who knew her extremely well might have noticed the slight change in her breathing, the momentary unfocusing of her gaze as memories cascaded through her mind. "I see," she said finally, her voice neutral, and the people he owned still noted her choice of words. Not his slaves, but the people he owned, a subtle but significant distinction that centered humanity rather than status. It was typical of the careful precision with which Naomi always spoke. "To be sold at auction next month, according to my sources," Still replied, watching her carefully. "Approximately 60 individuals, including children born since your departure. The estate needs to satisfy creditors quickly, and human property is the most liquid asset available." His distaste for the terminology was evident. Unless, she prompted, one eyebrow raised slightly. Unless someone were to intervene, he placed a folded document on the desk between them. "This arrived yesterday by trusted courier. I believe it may be of particular interest to you." Naomi unfolded the paper, immediately recognizing the handwriting, precise, educated, with a distinctive flourish to the capital letters. It was a letter from Elijah, one of the twins who had been part of the pack that had hunted her a decade ago. The letter was brief but extraordinary. After the pack had disbanded following their failure to recapture her, Elijah and his brother Samuel had undergone a profound change of heart. The experience of being so thoroughly outmaneuvered by a woman they had been taught to consider inferior had forced them to question everything they had previously believed about the natural order of society. They had abandoned slave hunting, eventually becoming secret allies to the Underground Railroad, using their tracking skills now to misdirect other hunters and help fugitives escape. Their knowledge of the methods employed by slave catchers had saved dozens of lives over the years. Though they operated in deep secrecy, their true allegiances known only to a handful of trusted contacts like Still, and now, Elijah wrote, they had a proposition. With the sheriff's death and the impending auction, there was a narrow window of opportunity. For a sufficient sum, they could arrange for several key families from the Blackwood plantation to disappear before the auction took place. They had connections now, roots established, and the necessary documentation prepared. All that was needed was funding. He specifically mentions a family named Turner, Still said quietly, a mother, father, and 3 children. He thought they might be of particular significance to you. Naomi's carefully maintained composure wavered for the first time. Sarah Turner had been her closest friend at the Blackwood plantation, the person who had helped her maintain her sanity during those 7 years of planning and waiting. Sarah's husband, James, had risked his life more than once to deliver messages for Naomi, and their children had been born into bondage on the sheriff's land. Sarah had known about Naomi's escape plan. Not the details, which would have been too dangerous to share, but the fact that she was planning something. "When you get free," Sarah had whispered one night as they sat mending the sheriff's fine shirts by candlelight. "Remember us not to come back. Never that, but remember we're still here," Naomi had promised. It was a promise that had weighed on her conscience every day of her freedom. "How much?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. Still named a figure, substantial but not impossible. Naomi had lived frugally since gaining her freedom, saving most of her teacher's salary and supplementing it with income from private tutoring for wealthy families who valued her exceptional educational methods. She had accumulated a modest but significant nest egg, intended eventually for establishing her own school, where she could implement her educational philosophy without the constraints of the public school system. That dream would have to wait. "I'll provide the funds," she said decisively, "but I want more than just the Turners. There's a woman named Bessie who works in the kitchen, and her grandson Daniel, and the Cooper family from the East Fields." She continued, naming specific individuals and families, painting a mental map of people still had never met, but whom she had carried in her heart for a decade. Still made notes, impressed, as always, by her detailed recall and clear priorities. "I'll communicate with Elijah immediately. If all goes as planned, they could be here within a month." "But Naomi," he added, using her first name, now that the conversation had shifted to more intimate territory, "this will deplete most of your savings. Your school can wait." She interrupted firmly. "These people cannot." Still nodded, understanding completely. He had seen the same calculation made countless times by free black citizens, personal ambitions set aside, hard-earned security risked, all to extend the hand of freedom to others still in bondage. It was a solidarity born of shared experience, and the knowledge that true freedom could never be complete while others remained enslaved. "There is one more matter," he said, reaching into his coat to produce another letter. "This arrived separately through different channels. It's addressed to you personally." The envelope he handed her bore no name, only a small, carefully drawn symbol in the corner, a fox. Naomi's breath caught. It was a private joke, a reference to her final words to Silas 10 years ago. The fox who had studied the hounds. "I'll leave you to read it in privacy," still said, rising. "Come to my office tomorrow evening if you wish to proceed with Elijah's proposal. We'll need to move quickly." After he departed, Naomi remained at her desk, the unopened letter in her hands. The classroom around her, with its neat rows of desks, its shelves of books, its charts of multiplication tables and maps of the world, represented everything she had built in her decade of freedom, a life of purpose, of impact, of quiet dignity. Yet always in the background of this carefully constructed existence had been the knowledge that others who deserved the same opportunity remained in chains. Others who had helped her, protected her, kept her secrets. With careful fingers, she broke the seal on the mysterious letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing just a few lines of text, and beneath them, a signature that made her heart race. Tobias. Tobias had been the strongest member of the pack, a mountain of a man whose physical power had been matched only by his tracking skills. He had also been, Naomi recalled, the one who had seemed most troubled by their profession, the one who had occasionally shown small furtive kindnesses to the fugitives they captured. A drink of water here, a loosened rope there, nothing that would draw attention from the others, but enough to ease suffering when possible. The letter was brief and to the point. After the pack disbanded, Tobias had drifted west, eventually settling in Ohio. He had married, fathered children, established a small freight business, and he had never forgotten the woman who had outsmarted them so completely, who had revealed a fundamental flaw in their belief system with nothing more than her mind and her determination. "I write to warn you," his letter read. "Reed is still alive, still bitter about his humiliation, recently lost everything in a gambling debt, was heard in a tavern boasting he would find you, settled score, maybe just drunk talk, but thought you should know. He always was the most dangerous of us. Be careful, T. Reed." Even after 10 years, the name sent a chill through her. The cruelest member of the pack, the one who had enjoyed the suffering of their quarry, who had used his whip not just as a tool of control, but as an instrument of pleasure, the one whose eyes had held a promise of particular violence when they had cornered her, or thought they had, by the river a decade ago. From her desk drawer, she removed a small wooden box. Inside lay the few tangible connections to her past, a scrap of cloth from the dress she'd worn during her escape, a carefully preserved leaf from the forest where she had outsmarted the pack, and most precious of all, the hand-drawn map that had guided her to freedom. The map was faded now, its creases worn from the many times she had unfolded it over the years, not from necessity, but as a reminder of what careful planning and patience could accomplish. She traced the river bend with her finger, remembering how she had used the sheriff's own correspondence to discover the border change that would prove crucial to her escape. Knowledge was indeed power. She had taught herself that lesson first, and now she passed it on to her students each day. but knowledge also required vigilance. If Reed was indeed looking for her, and Tobias had no reason to invent such a warning, then her carefully constructed life might soon be at risk. Philadelphia was a large city with a substantial free black population, but it was not immune to the reach of slave catchers and bounty hunters. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made northern states increasingly dangerous for escaped slaves, regardless of how many years of freedom they had established. Carefully refolding the map and returning it to its box, Naomi turned her attention to the practical matters at hand. There would be arrangements to make, funds to transfer, preparations for the arriving families. They would need housing, employment, education for the children. Her carefully ordered life would become considerably more complicated, and now added to these concerns was the need for increased caution, perhaps even preparations for another move if Reed's threat proved credible. Canada, perhaps, or further west, where new identities might be easier to establish. But as she locked the classroom behind her and stepped into the Philadelphia spring evening, Naomi Freeman felt lighter than she had in years. The past could never be truly escaped. It shaped who she was, informed every decision she made, but perhaps it could be redeemed, one family at a time. The sheriff was dead, his empire crumbling, and from its ruins new lives would rise, guided by the woman who had once been his property, but had always, in the chambers of her mind, been free. As she walked home through streets where she could move without fear of immediate capture, Naomi allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, the same smile she had worn 10 years ago when she had extinguished the lamp in that first room of her freedom and faced the future on her own terms. The path ahead might contain new dangers, new challenges, new sacrifices. Reed might indeed be searching for her, driven by a decade of festering humiliation. The families from Blackwood Plantation would bring complications and responsibilities she could scarcely anticipate. Her dream of establishing her own school would be delayed, perhaps indefinitely, but she would face these challenges as she had faced all others, with careful planning, with strategic thinking, and with the unshakable conviction that freedom, once tasted, was worth any price to preserve and extend to others. Some stories, it seemed, did not end with escape. They merely began, and as Naomi turned the corner onto the modest street, where she maintained a small but comfortable apartment, she was already planning her next moves, not just for herself, but for all those who would soon depend on her guidance. The teacher had become a conductor, the student a master, the hunted a rescuer.